Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Richard Kreitner, who is the author of the new book, Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery, as well as the author of a number of other books. And he's also the host of the podcast Think Back, which is focused on American history. And we'll be discussing the new book about American Jews, the Civil War, and slavery. So thank you, Richard, for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. Really excited to chat with you.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners about yourself and your background.
Sure. I live in Beacon, New York, in the Hudson Valley, about an hour north of Manhattan. I grew up in New Jersey in a secular Jewish household, proudly culturally Jewish. But my dad's family is very frum, actually, which I think we talked about earlier. And so it was always something that I was exposed to, weddings and bar mitzvahs. I always greatly enjoyed the music and the merrymaking and the overall spirit. Such that my mother's mother actually once predicted that I would become a rabbi, which has not happened. But I've always been drawn to it. I was bar mitzvahed. And I went to college at McGill University in Montreal, where in my second year I began taking a year-long course in American Jewish history, which was actually the first, and I think possibly the only course in American history that I ever took in college. I majored in philosophy. And my joke has always been that if I majored in history, I'd probably be writing books about philosophy. Now, in that course, at the beginning, I kind of very quickly, actually, this is about 15 years ago, landed on this question of Jewish abolitionism. Just caught my attention. What happened when, a people defined by slavery found a refuge in a country also defined by slavery? And I was especially interested in those who were opposed to slavery. To what extent did their Judaism, and perhaps more to their point, their Jewishness, their identity, inform the position that they were taking? So I wrote a paper about that, and it just had its hooks in me right away. I continued with my studies, as I say, majored in philosophy, worked at a museum in Montreal called the Museum of Jewish Montreal, which was really my first experience doing actual historical work, working with old insurance maps and phone directories and writing little capsule biographies of rabbis and activists and writers in the Montreal Jewish community. And I'm almost forgetting what the original question was, my background. I guess I'm edging now into how I wrote my book. But that's kind of the story of how I landed on the subject.
Okay. So, yeah, how specifically, that's what I was going to ask you, how specifically did you get involved in, Jews and the Civil War? And more than the Civil War, it's not a book about, this is not really a book about Jews and the Civil War so much as Jews and, like I said, abolition. And even though you discussed Judah Benjamin and others, it's really a book focused on Jews and slavery. And that's the part that really interested you.
Yeah, really the political struggle over slavery is how I think about it. I just gave a talk this past weekend at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. And somebody there was asking me about generals and units in the armies. I was like, honestly, that's really not my interest. For my bar mitzvah, I was given 5 copies of a big coffee table book called Great Jews in Sports, and the last thing I wanted to do here was write Great Jews in the Civil War. I want to keep the focus on what the war was about, which is the political struggle over slavery. So, I wrote this paper at McGill in college, and the idea just kind of stuck with me. And then all through, I guess, the 2010s, just every Seder I attended, I was just thinking, why are we not talking about this? Why are we not talking about the fact that we live in a country that was defined by slavery and continues to be, I believe, by its legacy in many, many, many ways. And this was, people, we've started to talk about this more explicitly, I think, in the years since with the rise of Black Lives Matter and then subsequently the 1619 Project. There's been a lot of debates now over the role of race and slavery in American history. And I just thought that this was kind of unexamined angle to the story. And, at the same time, I think there's a sense, I got the sense among many American Jews is that's not our story. We arrived later for the most part after 1880, my own ancestors for the most part around 1905. And therefore we are kind of, the Civil War, slavery, that's really not about us. We have nothing to do with that. We have no work to do, today about it. I argue that's really not the case. There was an American Jewish community at the time. It was much, much smaller than it eventually became by 1900 or so. But there were American Jews, and they made certain decisions, certain choices. They took different stances, to some extent, all across the spectrum, informed by their Jewishness. And so that just, each Passover, really, I was just like, gosh, this is such a good story. And if, as with every book I've written, and I think most people who write books, it's like, if nobody else is going to do this, I want to read this book, so I'm going to have to write it. I'm going to have to write it.
Yeah, and so let's start there. Let's first turn to when's the main time period under discussion here in this book and this podcast, and what's going on at the time before we get to the Jewish community, which is very small. But let's for the listener, I mean, some listeners are familiar with it, but for those that aren't, or for those that want to know specifically what we're talking about, what's going on in the United States at the time, and when are we discussing?
Sure. Yeah, I end up dropping back a little bit, but basically the book begins with 1848, the year 1848, which is this year of massive upheaval and revolution in Europe, which one of my characters, August Bondy, participated in. And then, the revolutions failed, and what followed was a period of repression that sent a lot of immigrants to the United States from Germany, from Austria, and some of whom were Jews. So they arrive in an America that is, in 1848 or thereabouts, that is probably the greatest place that there's ever been for, in the last, hundreds or thousands of years for Jews to live in. They're completely free. They're citizens. They're accepted. They are free to worship as they please, work as they please, live where they please, marry whoever they want. They're not going to be drafted into any kind of cockamamie, armies and wars. So it's a really great place to be a Jewish person. And some of the Jewish arrivals say this explicitly, that there's only one problem really with the country, and that is that slavery exists. And no, Jews are not the ones who are going to be enslaved. That's African American people. But this is a real blight on the landscape, and it's increasingly defining American politics into the 1850s, which is the decade before the war. The Civil War begins in 1861, following Lincoln's election in 1860. And through the 1850s, this political struggle over slavery that I mentioned is getting increasingly violent, increasingly heated. There's a proxy war, basically, between the North and the South that takes place in Kansas over the question of whether slavery will expand to the West, to the new territories and states that are going to be carved out of the land west of the Mississippi River. August Bondy, who I mentioned participating in the Vienna Revolution of 1848, actually fights in that battle with John Brown, this hardcore abolitionist who ends up, launching trying to organize a slave insurrection at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which basically kind of kickstarts the final march to the Civil War. August Bondy and two other Jewish immigrants fought with John Brown in Kansas to keep slavery from expanding west. And so, this new generation of immigrants, of Jewish immigrants arriving in America from Germany and Central Europe in the 1840s and 1850s lands in this country that's increasingly undergoing this upheaval over slavery. And depending on where they live, they may or may not be expected to take a side.
Now, let's just talk also about the Jewish community in America at the time. You mentioned it's small. You mentioned some of the figures we'll get to shortly. But where is the community focused? There's the larger communities, I guess, and what are the numbers generally the community we're talking about?
Yeah, in 1850, there's right around when the story begins, there's about 50,000 Jews in the United States. And in 1860, at the very beginning of the war, there's 150,000. So the population triples in the space of only 10 years, really the first half of my book. And they're mostly located in seaboard cities and large towns, Charleston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, not so much Boston, increasingly spreading west. So Chicago, Cincinnati, Memphis, New Orleans certainly are starting to get larger Jewish communities. But there's a lot of peddlers, a lot of these Jewish immigrants, when they first arrive, they're basically trying to sell goods from their backpacks or from a wagon, and they're going around the countryside. So there are Jews spreading throughout the hinterland and through the countryside in both the North and the South. And they're really scattered everywhere. They're concentrated in these cities, but you could really find them everywhere, in the United States at that time. So it's about 150,000 at the outbreak of the Civil War. And I think it's something like 4-1 there in the North versus the South.
What is is there a general pervasive attitude amongst the Jews of the United States at the time towards slavery and towards abolition?
Not really, honestly. And there's some really interesting primary sources that comment on this. There's an 1853 report by an abolition society noting regretfully that the Jews have no community opinion about this. They really have no community. They have no national community. There's no chief rabbi in America. There's no overarching national organization, though some people are trying to create one. But it's a very diffuse, decentralized community. And so in the South, you're generally going to agree with the Southern position that slavery is okay. If you didn't think that, you probably weren't going to head there in the first place. And even if you did think that and you arrived in the South, you're certainly not going to say anything or probably write anything about it because you'd be taking your life into your hands. In the North, it's a more interesting question. You know, you're allowed to criticize slavery, but it's not a particularly wise thing to do if you belong to this very small, vulnerable immigrant community at a time, which we should talk about, of rising nativism, rising anti-immigrant sentiment that is not necessarily directed at the Jews. It's more at Catholics, Irish Catholics especially. But a lot of Jewish leaders fear that it will turn to them next, that their comfortable abode in America is going to be compromised and challenged, and they might lose it. And therefore, you're not going to join the abolition movement, which is not a popular movement. That's a really fringe movement that's arguing for the eradication, the abolition of slavery. And it's a movement that is largely Christian inflected. So most people in the abolitionist movement were really intense, almost evangelical Christians, who were not shy in noting that, in publicly identifying themselves as such. And somebody like William Lloyd Garrison, who some of your listeners might have heard of, who was the real overarching figure in the abolitionist movement, he was constantly invoking the Old Testament. He was constantly talking about the prophets and quoting Psalms. But anytime the question came to, actual existing 19th century Jews, he was pretty anti-Semitic, he was pretty harsh about it. And he would constantly go out of his way to point out that one of his critics was Jewish. Even though he, we'll get to Ernestine Rose, he actually knew and was friends with at least one Jewish activist who was part of abolitionism. But for the most part, Jews wanted to basically stay away from abolitionism. So to return to your question, I think for the most part, they were fairly, if not apathetic, then detached from the overall controversy. They were not trying to make a big noise and draw attention to themselves over this issue.
But was that apathy because the Jews were saying we're in a new country, or even if they're here before, we don't want to be involved, we just want to stay low, keep a low profile? Or was it because what you're saying, there was anti-Semitism, an abolition movement, or they were opposed to abolition? Like, do we know any sort of reason why?
Yeah, I think the latter is probably best understood as a reason why, if you were otherwise inclined, if you were a politically engaged person and you were otherwise inclined to be critical of slavery, that's a reason why you're not going to join this explicitly Christian movement. But I think for the large population, it's really more the former. They were just way more interested in getting a toehold in this country, figuring things out, putting a roof over their heads, and getting started than they were in participating in these political debates. The connection to 1848, the revolutions in Europe, is that the arrival of some Jewish immigrants who had participated in that revolution, and in doing so were kind of imbued with these liberal, political principles, they're the ones who do come here and start to get involved in anti-slavery politics. So they kind of came and disrupted this status quo of we're just trying to get along and keep our heads down. And it's people like August Bondy who arrived in America already committed to these ideas of liberty and equality and freedom, who said, okay, now I'm in America. What's the problem here in America that needs my attention? And they found that it was slavery.
So your book tells a broad story, and it does so. You mentioned before, like you have the famous Jews in sports. So you didn't do that here in the Civil War, but you did pick 6 figures to kind of through their eyes or through their stories to kind of tell the broader, greater story here in the book. And so you focused on 6 Jews that they're really from really right to left or left to right. You kind of cover everything, different types of Jews, different positions on things. So you have Rabbi Morris Raphael, who is in New York, and we'll talk about him, who is an Orthodox rabbi. You have Isaac Mayer Wise, the Reform rabbi, the head of really the Reform movement. You have David Einhorn, who is a radical Reform rabbi in Baltimore. You have August Bondy, who you've mentioned. You have Ernestine Rose, who's this woman. She grows up, her father was a rabbi in Europe, and she comes here and she's an atheist at the time. And then you have Judah Benjamin, who, Jewish, and he's someone in the South. He has no connection to his Judaism whatsoever. So these are kind of the figures that you look through. And I it's interesting. Like I said, they run all different types of their connection to their Judaism and also to this question of abolition and to slavery in general. So I don't know if you want to just briefly, if you want to go through each one individually, and the book kind of it weaves through their story throughout, going from. Chronologically, you're going from 1848 to then you kind of discuss each one. I mean, we're obviously, read the book for more. We're not going to go through the entire book here on the episode. But I don't know if you want to talk about each one individually now, just mention their brief story and then we can get to how they connect here, or you want to start one at a time. I don't know how you want to do that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is really one thing about this book that really excited me as opposed to my last book was a history of secession in the United States, which basically covered like 4 centuries. And I just had to move very quickly through time and not spend too much time with any particular person. This one, I was really excited to dig into character and setting and, a little more of the nitty gritty detail of the past. So I basically see it as in the foreground is these 6 characters. In the middle ground is the American Jewish story. And then in the background is what's going on in the country, at the time. I see them as kind of arrayed across 2 different spectrums. One is a political spectrum and one is a religious spectrum. So politically, on the left, you have really 3 anti-slavery figures. One actual real abolitionist, Ernestine Rose, who, in addition to being a rabbi's daughter in Poland, who falls in Europe with a group of socialists in England and comes to America and establishes this career, is really mostly what she was a women's rights activist. 12 years before the organized women's rights movement really got its start at Seneca Falls in upstate New York, she was arguing for laws that would allow married women to keep their property in marriage, which did not exist at the time. And she was an atheist, as you say, and not passively an atheist. She organized what she called infidel conventions, which were these meetings of people who got together and denounced organized religion, Christianity and Judaism both, in her mind. While at the same time, and this is one of the stories of the book that we probably won't be able to get to, I do think she's defined by her Judaism and by her Jewish background in a lot of ways. And she says that explicitly at a few moments, including one during the Civil War itself, in the context of this rise of anti-Semitism during the war. I think she reveals that she's actually much closer to Judaism and much more aware of the currents that were evolving in the religion at the time than she had otherwise made known. And she's an abolitionist. She lands in New York in 1836 and immediately starts denouncing slavery as a violation of the Declaration of Independence. Like, her critiques of slavery are very, I don't want to say familiar, but they're what we would like people in the past to have said about slavery, that it contradicted American ideals, which was not a common thing to say at the time. It took a lot of guts, and her life was threatened on several occasions. So she's on the left, and then joining her on that side, on the political side, I would say August Bondy, who fought against slavery in Kansas and then joined the Union Army explicitly. He said because he was Jewish, he felt that he had the responsibility to fight for a constitution and for a country that guaranteed equality for all beliefs. Even though he was a pig farmer, he did not keep kosher, but he was a very proud Jew, and he kept, he forms kind of the backbone. I start the book and end the book with him because he left this really incredible memoir that has never really been used too much before. That's currently in the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan, and also a different version in Kansas, where he lived. Which really he kept it explicitly because he wanted everybody to know that Jews were involved, that they were there in the Civil War and in the fights over slavery before it. And then David Einhorn, the radical rabbi who you mentioned, I don't want to say the hero of the book, but one of my favorite characters to learn about. Whether you agree with his kind of religious views or not, which I think he rightly characterized as fairly radical, he believed that revelation was not a one-time occasion that happened at Mount Sinai, but in almost a kind of Protestant Reformation idea, was something that every Jew could access at any time. And he believed that the religion could be updated to suit, modern times. And that informed his belief that slavery, just because it was in the Old Testament, did not mean that it was legitimate in the modern day. But, more kind of, in a more kind of secular vein, he arrives in Baltimore in 1855, summoned by a Reform synagogue in the city from Germany. And he immediately begins denouncing slavery, even though Baltimore is a slave city at the time. Maryland was a slave state, which is a tremendously courageous thing to do. And he ends up paying a very serious price for it. which is in the book. I'm going very slowly here through my spectrum and through my characters. So those are the three that I think you would find on what we might call the political left of the spectrum. And then moving to the right, there's Isaac Mayer Wise, who is a Reform rabbi, as you said, but I find a somewhat less principled one than David Einhorn. He had this idea of devising he didn't want separate denominations of Judaism. He wanted a singular American Judaism that would in fact be updated to modern times, but he was willing to negotiate far more than Einhorn was about what the actual contours of that new type of Judaism would look like. And because he was much more interested in a kind of negotiation there, he was also willing to kind of give and take about slavery. He lived in Cincinnati, which was on the Ohio River, right between the North and the South. North of the Ohio River, slavery was outlawed, and south of it, where half of the subscribers of his newsletter lived, his newspaper, The Israelite, and many friends and family of his, slavery was, of course, allowed in the South. And so Wise did not want to press too hard on this issue. He didn't want Jews to get involved really in American politics at all as Jews, except on issues of relevance to them. Like, he was very concerned about the rise of nativism and to what extent that meshed with abolitionism. He believed that the rise of Christian abolitionists would spell disaster for American Jews. So he basically, on the eve of the Civil War, he issues an editorial in his newspaper that is titled "Silence Our Policy." So the policy of him and of his newspaper and what he believed it should be of all American Jews was that we should stay silent on this issue, on slavery and on the Civil War. We should wait it out. And that was, as I said before, a very common view. And then there is Morris Jacob Rafal, as you mentioned, who's an Orthodox rabbi, even though I'm not sure that he would have necessarily acknowledged that term because he didn't believe that Reform was a Judaism, and so therefore he was simply a rabbi. And somebody like David Einhorn was neither a rabbi nor Jewish. But Rafal is born in Sweden. His father seems to have been involved in the Swedish court in some way. He moves to England, where he studies both secular and religious subjects, which is very interesting, kind of sets him apart from some of his fellow traditionalist rabbis, both in England and later in America. He's extremely learned. He gives lectures in England and then later in America, to which he moves in 1850, on biblical poetry and on post-biblical history of the Jewish people. And he kind of fancies himself an interlocutor between Jews and Gentiles, especially high-class Gentiles. Jonathan Sarna has described him as America's first glamour rabbi. He was he's the first rabbi to deliver an opening prayer before Congress. But most famously or infamously, he delivers this sermon in early 1861 at the very beginning of the Civil War, right before it begins, which is called The Bible View of Slavery, in which he purports to settle a debate that was raging in the country as the Civil War took off over whether slavery was justified by the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he is an expert. He fancies himself an expert and interlocutor, for non-Jews about the Torah. He is the one who can answer this debate definitively about whether the Torah defended slavery. And he said that it did. And he had his reasons for doing so, and we can talk about that. And then finally, there's Judah Benjamin, who is eventually the Confederate Secretary of State, one of the most high-ranking American Jews in history, the only Jewish person whose face has appeared on American currency, if you count the Confederate $2 bill as American currency, which personally I would. And he is politically far to the right. He was a slave owner. He was a plantation owner who owned more than 100 people on his sugar plantation in Louisiana and defended slavery, one of the most eloquent defenders of slavery in the Congress before the Civil War, and was Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, the Confederate president. He's a fascinating figure, a complicated figure. We could do a whole hour just on Judah Benjamin. But what's really interesting about him is that even though he's on the far right of the political spectrum, he's not on the religious spectrum. He had, as you said before, he had no Jewish identity at all, really. Isaac Mayer Wise once had a kind of theological discussion with him and came away like, this guy knows nothing about Judaism, which is interesting because he was very much identified as Jewish. before the war and especially during the war when he was scapegoated for lots of reasons. So those are the characters. I only talked about the political spectrum. They're scrambled on the religious one to some extent, which is one of the interesting things about the book, the way in which these people's kind of debates among one another about religion informs and does not inform their politics at different times.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And reading the book, you really see that. How, although there's no real common thread in that sense. How their connection to Judaism and their opinion on abolition and slavery, it's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, just if I can, like the major figures in the book, like the Reform rabbis are, Einhorn is critical of slavery and Rafal defends it to some extent, but it's not like that was entirely the case. There was a radical Reform rabbi allied with Einhorn who lived in Charleston, South Carolina, who totally defended slavery and the Confederacy. So they agreed on the religious stuff, but disagreed on and there were anti-slavery Orthodox rabbis as well.
Correct. So just a little bit more on them. So Raphael, he argued, he fought with Reform, as you say. He was in Charleston debating them. He definitely was. I think Poznansky was definitely involved in that. He actually was in England. He actually published the first Jewish periodical there called the Hebrew Review and Magazine of Rabbinical Literature. Actually, he did it for 3 years and then he stopped. It's really interesting for those that look in there. He has translated a lot of Sefer Ikrim Valbo. He translated Naftali Hertz Wesley's Yain Levanon, his Pirush on Pirkei Avos there into English. So he was definitely interesting. He wasn't this radical, not the word radical, but he wasn't like an extreme Orthodox rabbi, again, to use that term. He wasn't. He was definitely more, I don't know what the word is, like, open-minded, so to speak.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that really fascinated me and surprised me in researching him, because, this debate over slavery if you're familiar with American Jewish history, just, about this debate and this occasion. It's just never really been kind of fleshed out. Nobody's ever really put meat on the bones of who were these people, what was the context, what else was going on, both in the American Jewish community at the time and in the U.S. overall. But Rafal, really surprised me. I had understood him from those other accounts kind of offhandedly as an kind of arch traditionalist, and he really wasn't. And that actually got him into trouble, in both Europe and in America, as I understand it. And there's no biography of him, kind of tragically. I don't think he left enough in his papers. And this is the pro-slavery sermon is really the only thing that he's known for. But there have been a couple treatments of him. And as I understand it, that Hebrew magazine that he founded in London ended after such a short period because it wasn't supported by the Jewish community, right? He was delving too much into secular subjects for the interests of the true arch traditionalists in England, who weren't very interested in that kind of stuff. So he is a very interesting figure. And when he arrives in America, he immediately starts dabbling in politics a little bit. He gets involved. He endorses somebody in some kind of New York City municipal race. He gets chastised by the board of his synagogue for that. I think one reason he might have given this Bible view of slavery sermon is because he wants to express his independence and say, just because you censured me over that endorsement of I think it was the position was city recorder or something, or sheriff. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be chastened and not say what I want. He did to some extent keep his feet in both worlds.
Yeah, he does. You say there's no biography of him. He's done a couple of things. He writes this two volumes, the history of the Jews post Churban, post the destruction of the temple, and he's also a really wonderful English writer, which is interesting because he's not a native English speaker. He comes from Sweden. I think he went to Germany. He's not a native English speaker. And then he has a small book. He talks about a sermon about the immortality of the soul. And what's interesting also about just to talk about him once we're talking about the sermon, which has been reported and it's written about, ad nauseum, really. Anything you Google his name will just come up with many articles about him. Is that not to defend what he said, but he does say in his speech where he defends, the institution of slavery, of enslaving human beings, he does say that the slavery practiced in the South is not the slavery of the Bible, and the slavery of the Torah is much more humane. He does say that in his sermon.
Right. Well, it's basically a peace proposal. It's almost absurd, actually. He's basically saying, okay, I'm a rabbi. I know the Torah. Let me tell you what it actually says. What it says is that slavery is acceptable, and it's still acceptable because nothing has changed, nothing significant. But this way the South is practicing slavery is too dehumanizing, and therefore here's the deal. The South changes its practice of slavery to make it more humane in accordance with the Mosaic Law, and the North will stop condemning slavery, and we can avoid this entire civil war. I say in the book that he's basically trying to solve the crisis of the Union and bring the two pieces of the country back together and use Judaism as the glue, and it doesn't work out. And you mentioned the immortality book. What's striking to me is that, as I said before, this is the only thing for which he has become, to some extent, immortal or remembered at all. Not at all his famous sermons that he gave, his speeches. He's only known for this one particular very problematic sermon. And yeah, one reason I wanted to kind of make him a character was to not necessarily give him his due or rescue him, because I do think that was supremely ill-calculated. But was to kind of understand his context and try to figure out what he thought he was doing,
Yeah, what is interesting, one more note on him, is that, you said, he wasn't this arch traditionalist, but you look at the picture of him, he doesn't have a beard, he's clean shaven, but he's got this big, kind of almost like a black velvet yarmulke you could see, and he's got this big yarmulke, and he does look like traditional. In that sense, you could Google him and you'll see a picture of him. But right away when he gives that sermon, the press, it's reported on every newspaper in New York the next day, and then all around, and I think Einhorn is the one who hits back, and I mean, some of the other ones you mentioned really hit back and push back and attack him.
Yes. Well, first, it's a guy named Michael Hyprin, who is another veteran of the 1848 revolutions. I think he was from Hungary, who first criticizes Rafal in the New York Tribune, one of the major newspapers of the time. And Einhorn is this rabbi, as I mentioned, in Baltimore. He's also got his own paper. Every rabbi had their own newspaper at the time. Very cool. In the Sinai was his newspaper, and he delivers a sermon in his Baltimore shul and then publishes it in the Sinai, and it's picked up and translated into English and published in English newspapers, and it raises this huge storm of controversy. And he basically he says it's a shanda, it's a shanda that somebody would speak out in favor of slavery on behalf of Judaism. And his real concern is that that's going to be confused for not Rafal's position, but the position of all American Jews. And he says some very interesting and I think fairly damning things, such as that if this position is accepted as the position of American Jews, it would embolden the enemies of the Jewish people, which he was under no, illusions there were and always had been. It would embolden the enemies of the Jewish people to say, such are the Jews. Where they are oppressed, they cry out against oppression and against bondage. Where they are free, as in America in 1861, they say that slavery is endorsed by God. It's, to my mind, a very damning kind of assessment of the apathy that we talked about, and even the pro-slavery, commentaries of Rafal and others. So Einhorn delivers this sermon. It's published in the Sinai newspaper and then translated into English. And in April of 1861, just a couple days after the firing on Fort Sumter begins the Civil War in earnest, there's this massive riot in Baltimore, which again is a slave city in a slave state. Many people wanted Maryland to secede from the Union and join all the other states that had already done so and join the Confederacy, which would put Washington, D.C., in grave jeopardy because Washington is between Maryland and Virginia. So if Maryland seceded as well as Virginia, that'd basically be the ball game. The Confederacy would either be an independent nation or Lincoln would have to, resign or something. It would have completely changed things. So it's a very dangerous period in Baltimore, and basically a pro-slavery mob, knowing what Einhorn has said in favor of abolitionism, has a list and goes and basically tries to hunt him down and lynch him, it seems. And he is warned in time by federal soldiers, and he and his wife, who's pregnant at the time, get out just in time and take a wagon to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, he gets a letter from his congregation in Baltimore saying, hey, it's quieter now. This is a few weeks later. We would like you to come back. But as long as you stay quiet on the explosive issues of the day, which is, of course, a reference to slavery. And Einhorn refuses. He says, I'm not going to go back.
Yeah, and Einhorn is interesting also, to mention that, and I think I forgot to mention that he does learn in the Fjord Yeshiva. He does, grow up in the Orthodox, he goes to regular yeshiva, and then he becomes this radical reformer. When he comes in, you mentioned translated to English. That's because his sermons, everything speaks in German. His paper, I believe, was in German as well. He is German. Now, just another thing to mention as you talk about the apathy is that one figure that is noticeably absent in your book is Isaac Leeser. The famous, very famous, one of the most famous American Jews at the time in Philadelphia, who has another newspaper. You mentioned everyone's got a newspaper. He's got the famous newspaper. He's kind of Isaac Mayer Wise's nemesis. He's got his newspaper, The Accident, or in full, The Accident, an American Jewish Advocate. And so what's Leeser's position or lack of position regarding slavery throughout this?
Yeah, I both appreciate you asking, and I dreaded this moment because, as we were talking before you came on, it's a popular history, and 6 characters is kind of enough. Lisa would certainly, make the cut if I was to expand it at all. Not least because he grew up in the South. He spent a lot of time in Richmond. So he was fully imbued with the Southern kind of understanding of slavery and of the political struggle over it. He was basically like Isaac Mayer Wise politically, I would say, maybe a little bit to the right, fairly sympathetic to the South at the outbreak of the Civil War, skeptical of Lincoln. So maybe that's one reason why I didn't kind of introduce him as a separate character. He doesn't add too much to the political debate. He's not that different from Wise, even though they're very different, religiously, of course. But I regret it. I don't regret it, but I lament that I couldn't, include him in the book. He's a very interesting character. He dies a little bit earlier than most of the other people, I think, in about 1867. He's a little older. But yeah, he was sympathetic really largely to the South, and that probably has a lot to do with the time that he spent in Virginia.
Right. So Wise, you talk about who didn't like Lincoln, but one thing that does when Grant issued General Orders Number 11, Wise does go running to Washington to say to Lincoln, and says, well, please, have Grant rescind that order.
Yeah, I mean, to say that Wise did not like Lincoln is almost to put it very mildly. He had really wild and actually kind of funny things to say about Lincoln. Like in 1860, after Lincoln's election, or early 61, I guess, Lincoln is taking the train from Springfield to Washington, D.C., famously to take the helm of the presidency. And Wise goes in Cincinnati. He goes down to the train station to see him. And he writes publicly in his newspaper, he writes very contemptuously of Lincoln's like gangly, rough frontier appearance, and says he's an ill fit for the presidency. He's unpresidential, as we would say now, and that he's totally ill-equipped for the job. And Wise was really critical of the Republican Party, which was this, new party created in 1854, specifically in response to the controversy over Kansas, which I mentioned earlier. Would slavery spread to Kansas? The Republican Party is the first mass anti-slavery coalition in the world in 1854. There are some Jews involved in its creation, but Isaac Mayer Wise is not one of them. He's really suspicious of the party because he sees it, and to some extent he's right, as an alliance between abolitionism and nativism, which, as I mentioned, is this kind of rising political movement at the time. And the Republican Party is sucking up both of these coalitions into its ranks. And Wise is really skeptical of that. So there's no Republican presidential candidate who he would have supported in 1860. He did not think slavery was as important as an issue that it needed to be dealt with. Certainly not to the extent of breaking apart the country. Now, what's interesting about Wise is he's really critical of Lincoln throughout the war. He wants to run for political office, actually, as a state senator in 1864. He's recruited by the Democratic Party in Ohio to run for state senate, and the leader of his synagogue, I think the board of his synagogue, tells him not to. They were largely Republicans, and they didn't want him getting so involved in politics. So he's a Democrat and really anti-Lincoln through the war. But after Lincoln's assassination, he almost immediately and completely 180 degrees changes his tune. And he realizes that Lincoln was right, actually, about slavery and not Wise. And he won't go too far with that. He doesn't emphasize that too much in his later writings. But he will, after the war, really praise Lincoln in a way that many Jews did, which I see as a kind of form of compensation for the ways in which he neglected to take that view during the war and before it.
Yeah, and then we get to, Judah Benjamin. And Judah Benjamin, as we've mentioned, and you talk a lot about him, and there's been a lot written about him, but he's someone that is Jewish, and that really is where it ends. I mean, he really has no connection whatsoever to Judaism. He's not married Jewish. He has nothing to do with Judaism. He doesn't know anything. He's also clueless. He just doesn't know anything about Judaism. Yet he's portrayed, especially by the Union side, he's always given this like anti-Semitic caricature is what that's how they talk about him.
Really more, I mean, yes, but also by the South. He becomes by both. He becomes a scapegoat for Southern citizens, white citizens, for all the kind of failures of the Confederate government, both diplomatically. He was the Secretary of State, so it was his job to kind of get Britain and France to acknowledge the Confederacy's existence and independence, which he failed to do. Nobody could have succeeded at that. Before that, he's the Secretary of War, quite absurdly, because he is the least martial figure you can imagine. He had never been near a battlefield, except possibly when he was a toddler in the Caribbean during the Napoleonic Wars. But he knew nothing of war, and all the Confederate generals, Beauregard, all the major Confederate generals were constantly sending notes to Jefferson Davis talking about how little Benjamin knew about war. So he became the scapegoat, really, for a lot of the Confederate shortages, and, in a classic kind of anti-Semitic vein. Benjamin is a fascinating figure. There have been a few biographies, none completely satisfying, though James Traub's most recent effort, which I reviewed, is, I think, fairly good, but also very narrow, very, very small. He's a fascinating figure. He's born in the Caribbean. He's raised in Charleston, South Carolina. He as an adult had no connection to Judaism, but his father was a member of Beth Elohim, the very old synagogue in Charleston, and led one of the first efforts to reform it, to bring Reform Judaism to America in the 1820s, really even before it had totally reached its apogee in Europe. And his dad was just kind of a lazy, irresponsible figure. But he was involved in the temple to the extent that he wanted to change it radically. But Benjamin himself, he had no connection to organized Judaism in New Orleans, which he ended up moving to. He attended Yale as only the second ever Jewish student at Yale, though he's kicked out under very mysterious circumstances. It's not clear what happened. Possibly something to do with gambling, which was a weakness of his. He moves to New Orleans, which is a much more congenial city with all the mixture of peoples and languages and races and religions for a young, ambitious Jewish lawyer, which is what he was, to rise and make a career. And in New Orleans, he had nothing to do with the organized Jewish community. He marries a Catholic Creole woman who asks him to convert. He refuses to convert, which is interesting. He had nothing to do with Judaism, but he did refuse to convert, which a lot of Jewish men in his circumstance did. And as you say, he was always seen as Jewish. He was forced kind of to live as a Jewish man, even though he wouldn't have himself wanted to, because everybody, never let him forget that he was Jewish. But he's a fascinating individual. My editor, in talking to me about the book, said something to the effect that it seems like he was the person who I came to like most of all the 6 characters in my book, which is certainly not true in some respects. And, in moral respects, he was, again, fierce defender of slavery, practitioner of it. In political respects, the Confederacy, I think, was a horrible mistake. But as a person, he's a very interesting guy. He's a real stoic. He refuses to let things get him down. He's the only Confederate statesman to avoid getting arrested at the end of the war. And these are some of my favorite pages to write, the story of his escape from the fall of the Confederacy. And he ends up going to England, where he makes a career as a barrister, a very, very, very successful career. But he survived something like 3 shipwrecks.
I loved reading those pages. Those were great. By the way, just in general for the listeners, and I said this to you off air, and I'll say this again. I read many history books, and those written by academics, and those written by journalists, and you can tell the distinction. And this, you're a journalist by trade, and this more than and you read this book, and it's very readable. It's a real pleasure to read, and I can tell reading those pages. Good to hear you confirm it that you really enjoyed writing General Benjamin. I hear where your editor's coming from, because you really, definitely connected with Benjamin like that in some way, even if a lot of the parts that you obviously don't agree with him, but that was fascinating also that he got out. He's such a high-ranking official. He's the Secretary of State. He's a right-hand man, and he gets out somehow, some way. He escapes. He evades capture. He's the only one. Yeah, tell that story. He gets in, and by the way, a barrister is a lawyer in England, and he writes actually this famous treatise that's still studied, or it was studied. He becomes this. He makes a career for himself there.
He's absolutely brilliant. What's interesting about Benjamin is that burned his papers twice in his life. He burned his papers before leaving Richmond with the rest of the Confederate government in 1865, and again also in London before he died in 1884. He did not want, he said this explicitly, any biography to be written of him. He was incredibly well read. He could quote Shakespeare and modern ancient poetry offhand, and he knew what biographies do to people's reputations, and he wanted to avoid that for himself. So it's hard to say what's really kind of motivating him at any particular juncture. I try to kind of dig through it and come up with basic theories, and I think there's several moments where you see, and I really don't want this to be kind of apologetic towards Benjamin. There have been some Confederate, lost cause, nostalgic kind of biographies written of him that I think take this line of inquiry too far. But I think there are several moments in his life where you can see him separating himself from this Southern slaveholder planter phenomenon that he was otherwise in his life trying to join. He buys a plantation, I think, to basically advance his political career, which works. He's appointed to the United States Senate. And then more or less once he's appointed to the Senate, he sells the plantation. It has served its purpose. So he certainly wanted to join the Southern gentry. But I think there's several moments in his life where you can see him kind of separating himself from that phenomenon. For instance, at the very end of the Civil War, he suggested that the Confederate government emancipate enslaved people in the South, enslaved military-aged men, and arm them and sign them up for the Confederate ranks, which had been so thinned out by the Union armies, and in exchange for freedom. So this would basically be abandoning slavery, which is the institution that the Confederate government was fighting to protect, for the sake of Southern independence, which is something that really no other leading Confederate politician was willing to countenance. Now, some have claimed, I think it's too much to say that this is on account of his Jewishness or something, but I do think it's on account of his outsiderness to the Southern elite. And I think that outsiderness has something to do with his Jewishness.
Yeah, he's definitely a very interesting figure. And you mentioned the new biography that came out through the Jewish Lives series is the one I believe you were referencing before. Now, we mentioned Lee Serwin. There are definitely other figures that come into this book. And some of them are, the Lehman brothers make an appearance and their involvement. And that's really what is the Jewish involvement with the slave trade? And we mentioned just Benjamin had slaves, but there are others. And what is the Jewish involvement with the slave trade, especially at this time in the United States?
Sure. Well, there's kind of two separate parts of that. One is the slave trade, which traditionally you would mean the Atlantic slave trade, which ends in the United States, legally at least, by 1807, which is one thing. And then separately is Jewish involvement in slavery. So to take, as it actually existed in antebellum America up to 1865 when it's abolished. To take the first one, this has been a major, major source of controversy and debate. And I don't know if scandal would be the right word, but there have been a lot of openly anti-Semitic publications arguing that Jews were responsible for the Atlantic slave trade. Especially the Nation of Islam put out a publication in the early 1990s called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which argued that Jews were almost exclusively responsible for the Atlantic slave trade, which is absolutely garbage, not true, debunked conclusively and fully by many, many, many historians. And, I was concerned myself. A lot of people around me in my life were concerned that my book would be kind of participating in that or contributing to that in some way. So those are also pages that I don't think it'd be accurate to say I took great joy in writing, but I was very, very happy with how I ended up treating this subject on the page. And in my own mind, I know that my interest in this is pure and not part of that kind of heinous phenomenon. What strikes me is that even if it is true, which these scholars who debunked the Nation of Islam report have shown, that Jewish participation in the Atlantic slave trade was completely proportionate to their, share of the overall white population, which is to say something like 2% of slave ships that crossed the Atlantic were either owned by Jews or captained by Jews or, Jewish investors, which is exactly, on par with their presence in the population. Even if that's true, that's still tens of thousands of people who were taken from Africa, on Jewish-owned ships or by Jewish-owned, by Jewish slave traders and brought to the Americas. And, some of those ships, it's disturbing to note, were named the Abraham and Sarah. the King Solomon. Like, those were the names of slave ships. Like, I can't not find that very disturbing, even if the numbers are not at all disproportionate. And I was interested in those stories, so I tell those stories in the book with all, I think, the appropriate caveats about how such stories and such figures have been wildly misused and mischaracterized. So that's the slave trade part of it. They were participants in it. I talk about somebody named Aaron Lopez, who people might have heard of in Newport, Rhode Island, who was invested in the slave trade as part of his much larger, trade commercial ventures at the time. And then later on, the actual existence of slavery, also Jews were, neither more nor less likely to own slaves than other white people in the antebellum United States. Both the North and the South had slavery until about the American Revolution or a few years after, and in the South until the Civil War. So there were not that many large Jewish planters, which there were of non-Jews, people who owned hundreds of slaves. You don't find too many Jews doing that. But if you lived in town and you ran a business, and you could afford to, you were certainly going to own slaves, whether you were Jewish or not. And so I try to kind of navigate between these two opposite poles of misrepresentations. On the one hand, that Jews were disproportionately involved in slavery or overly, more responsible than others for it, which is an anti-Semitic canard that I have no time for. Or on the other hand, a kind of wishful thinking that I find among many people that we're Jews. We were slaves in Egypt, and therefore, of course, we were, opposed to slavery. And people who go into my book with that kind of expectation are going to be disappointed and possibly disturbed by some of the stories in it.
However, there are stories like the Peter Still and the Friedman brothers who help him get out. You do talk about such stories, if you want to relay that story for the listeners.
Yeah, as you said at the beginning, I'm giving a full spectrum look here. I'm not interested in more of one thing than the other. I'm interested in the full story and the full range, really, of Jewish experience in the 19th century United States and of encounters with this question of the political struggle over slavery. So, in this chapter, in one chapter in the book, I opened with the Lehman Brothers, which, ended up being this large financial firm, but began as basically cotton traders, who often they owned enslaved people themselves, after arriving in Alabama in the 1850s. And they accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. So slavery was really embedded at the very beginning of the story of the Lehman Brothers Company. So that's the bad. The good is, this much less well-known story of a pair of Jewish brothers called Isaac and Joseph Friedman, who lived for the most part in Cincinnati, but for a few years in the 1850s, they lived in a town called Tuscumbia, Alabama. And they met there a enslaved man named Peter Still, who, was able, as many enslaved people were able to rent out his own time. So he worked for a school teacher, he worked for other people in the town. And he came to know the Friedman brothers, these Jewish immigrants, and he came to see that they respected him and that they treated him, as he put it, quote, as a man. And he thought, hey, maybe these people would help me get free. So he took a huge risk. He had no idea really of how they would respond. He took a huge risk by proposing to them that they buy him in order to free him, which was illegal at the time. Illegal for them and illegal for him. And they said yes. So they arranged to buy Peter Still from his owner, and he worked for them for a few months, and he was able to raise the amount of money to pay for his own purchase price. So it wasn't an entirely benevolent phenomenon, but it really was. They put themselves at great risk. And eventually they are able to smuggle him out to the north and back to freedom, and he reunites with his family in New Jersey. And he wrote a narrative of this experience and sold it in order to raise money to buy his family out from bondage in Alabama. So I juxtapose these two stories of the Lehman Brothers on the kind of bad side of the spectrum and the Friedman brothers on the good side of the spectrum to show that there was really nothing inevitable about the choices that people made. A lot of the biographers of the Lehman family will argue that they were Jews in the South. They were white people in the South. What else were you going to do? And I think this story shows that you could have made different choices. There's nothing inevitable about participating in this system.
Then there's something that, and this is discussed in I see this discussed in other books as well, which is split families. I remember when I did a podcast with Adam Mendelsohn, who wrote a book on the Jews in the army, in the Union Army, and I think that he's working on the Confederate Army. But talk about split families. You have families who kind of had family members on both sides of the divide, and actually some in the Union and some in the Confederacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that happened both for Jews and for non-Jews. I'm really glad you mentioned Adam Mendelsohn. I tried to give him adequate credit in the book because his work has really, I think, broken really important new ground. A little bit more on the kind of great Jews in the Civil War side of things, of looking at the soldiers, but really not. He's really offering some really complicated and complicating analyses of a lot of myths that have grown up over the years. So I'm glad you mentioned his work. I tried to mention it a few times in the book. The split families question is absolutely fascinating. That was true, as I say, for non-Jews as well. There's some fascinating stories that you can mention with this. One really noteworthy family is the Phillips family. So the husband, Philip Phillips, was a Jewish congressman in Alabama. He grew up in South Carolina. In the 1850s, he actually helps write the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is what opened the Kansas Territory to slavery and started this whole proxy war that I mentioned. But he ends up kind of, as the South becomes more and more radical in its defense of slavery, Phillips realizes that it's really a bad idea to secede from the Union to defend slavery. So he opposes the secession of the Southern states. His wife, Eugenia, who also grew up in South Carolina, she supports it. So this is a split family. He sides with the Union and she with the Confederacy. And she ends up getting arrested during the Civil War twice, first in Washington, D.C., for speaking out and possibly spying on behalf of the Confederacy. And she's imprisoned and they're deported from the United States to the Confederacy. They find their way to New Orleans, where they hope to kind of sit out the war in peace, far from the action. That ends up not happening because the Union Army invades New Orleans and occupies it in 1862, a year after the war began. And she is once again arrested for seemingly laughing at a passing funeral of a Union soldier, and she's sent to a island off the coast of Louisiana, and her husband, Philip Phillips, goes to the shore of Lake Pontchartrain every night looking for a ship with carrying her back. So he's a loyal husband, even though they completely disagreed about the politics of the Civil War. And she ends up getting freed. But there were several families that were totally split. Adolph Ox's father, Adolph Ox, who ended up buying the New York Times in 1896, his father was pro-Union. His mother was pro-Confederate. And there's several other families. There's a guy named Alfred Mordecai, who was a Union Army or United States Army officer in Albany, guarding an arsenal near Albany. And he was a son of the South, and he was fully expected to go and join the Confederacy, but he had married a woman from Philadelphia, so he didn't quite know what to do, and he ended up resigning his commission and trying to avoid the war entirely. But a lot of stories of families and loved ones caught on different sides of the war.
What about anti-Semitism? So we mentioned that throughout this podcast, but what was it like in the North and the South, both?
Yeah, it was a little different and quite similar. In both countries, in both parts of the country, in the Union and the Confederacy, people were suffering from all the usual kind of economic shortages. Food was scarce, especially in the South. The currency was worthless. Life in the South, especially, was really, really hard. And a lot of people took their ire out on the Jews, and especially on Judah Benjamin, as I mentioned. So there's a couple instances of towns in the South actually expelling Jews during wartime. One town in Georgia where Lazarus Strauss, the father of the family that ended up owning Macy's, lived. And that town, Talbot in Georgia, expelled Jews from its midst. They banned Jews from entering or living in the town. And Lazarus Strauss, who had lived there for many, many, many years and was one of maybe 2 or 3 families that lived in the town, decided he was going to leave. And the townspeople said, well, we didn't mean you. You're our friend. We've worked with you and shopped in your store for many, many years. We didn't mean you. We meant, this kind of vague Jewish menace. But he decided to leave anyway. So there are a couple of incidents like that in the South of people taking out their ire against Jews and especially against peddlers. And in the North, it was a little different. As you said, they were, very critical of Judah Benjamin, and used his position and that of other Jews in the Confederacy to depict the South as either controlled by Jews. And Benjamin was kind of the power behind the throne type figure. But especially, as you mentioned, Grant's Order Number 11 was kind of the big anti-Semitic moment of the Civil War, and really the most dramatic anti-Jewish measure that's ever been instituted by the United States government, probably to this day. And that came out of Grant, who at the time was not yet General-in-Chief of the overall U.S. Army. He had this kind of small military district in Mississippi and Western Tennessee and Kentucky. And, when the Union Army started to take territory in the South, it raised this question of whether the Union blockade would hold. The Union had instituted a ban on all trade of Southern cotton out of the country, a way to kind of strangle the Southern economy, keep Britain and France from joining the war effort. But what would happen when the Union started to take Southern territory? Should plantations in those lands be allowed to trade out, or should the blockade still hold? And while Lincoln and the U.S. government was still figuring this out, traders and speculators and merchants started making their way into this territory and trying to sell cotton to make money. And some of these traders and merchants and speculators were Jews. Many of them were not. It was this was a big story that was told at the time that they were all Jewish, but many of the people who told that story were themselves involved in the cotton trade and wanted to deflect attention from that and blame it all on the Jews. And Grant basically took those stories at face value and banned all Jews from his military district, an official order to deport Jews from their homes, not just outsiders who were there to trade cotton, but people who lived in towns in Mississippi and in Kentucky were actually roused from their beds in the middle of the night by United States soldiers and forced to march out of the district, which is not the kind of thing that had ever happened in the U.S. before or has happened since. And you mentioned regarding Isaac Mayer Wise, some Jews who were ousted from their homes and also others visited Lincoln and got the order overturned. American Jews were very grateful to Lincoln for doing that. I think the story is actually a little bit more complicated than that, and I try to show this in the book. The Grant Order is promulgated in late December of 1862, and it's rescinded by Lincoln about a week into 1863. The important thing that happened in the meantime, January 1st of 1863, is that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, banning the enslaved people owned by rebel planters. And these two documents were printed in some newspapers on the same page. So people read them at the same time. This order banning Jews from from Grant's military district and the Emancipation Proclamation freeing enslaved black people. So people like Isaac Mayer Wise took these two at the same time and understood that to not be any kind of coincidence that the fortunes of African Americans were rising at the same time that the fortunes of American Jews were falling, and that their status in America, which is where we began our conversation, seemed to be in jeopardy. And they freaked out a little bit. And I think this was a really traumatic episode. And a lot of stories about Grant's order celebrate Lincoln's intervention and depict it as kind of the birth of American Jewish politics. You're offended by some government decree or statement, you organize a delegation, you get it overturned. That's the way you do things in America. This is how it starts. But I think embedded right there at the very beginning of American Jewish politics is this sense of zero-sum competition with African Americans. And Wise and many other commentators are actually explicit about this. And I think that that's a kind of underappreciated part of that episode. And, overall, I think the American Jewish experience of the Civil War, and Mendelsohn is great on this question, it has been celebrated by past accounts as one of triumph, as one of Americanization. We fought for our cause, whichever side it was. We bled on the battlefield. Now we belong. Now we're accepted. But actually, if you really look at the stories, it seems to have been a fairly traumatic experience of anti-Semitism in both parts of the country, and that really kind of called into question this sense of belonging that had existed before the war.
Very interesting point. Now, what about the Jews in the South post the war.
This is also something that really surprised me after the war. And it's almost upsetting. I think it turns out that somebody like Isaac Mayer Wise was to some extent correct in that the abolition of slavery did upset the status, the privileged status that American Jews had enjoyed before the war. So in the antebellum South, which was, I think, an even friendlier place for Jewish people to live than in the North, they were fully accepted as white. They needed to be part of the white population because whites were in many places outnumbered by enslaved black people. And so they welcomed Jews as white people, basically. Now, what happens after the abolition of slavery is that very kind of clean racial hierarchy is now upset. Slavery is abolished. It's not clear really what hierarchy, what kind of social system is going to take its place. And it's not clear where Jews fit in that. In a country where race is a less kind of determining factor of what anybody's status is, I think that religion starts to become more important of a factor. And so Jews, though they're on the right side, for the most part, of this kind of racial divide, they're on the wrong side of the religious one. And so, as the white South reclaims power in the years after the war, overthrows Reconstruction, this effort to kind of ensure racial equality in the post-Civil War South and really enforce the Constitution in the southern states, as that's kind of rescinded and white Southerners retake power, the position of Jews becomes kind of uncertain and in some places even dangerous. And basically, this story ultimately culminates in the lynching of Leo Frank in 1915, this kind of dramatic moment of anti-Jewish violence in the South, which I don't really think, I argue in the book, is not really exceptional to the overall status of Jews in the South. I think it suggests that something had kind of fundamentally changed in the years after the Civil War. Their status had become a lot less kind of certain and even secure.
I want to end with something that maybe should have began with, which is why the title, Fear No Pharaoh? Especially because, I'll add to that question, that the book is not exactly, I think I saw a reviewer comment about this, about the book, that the book is not about Jews that are only abolitionists and anti-slavery.
No, it's not. I'm really glad you asked this question. So I actually had a different title. I had a different title for this book, which was going to be this: No More Pharaohs, No More Slaves. Now you'll read in Simon Schama's The Story of the Jews, a really, really good 2-volume book by the great British historian who I think has been knighted. You'll read this quote that August Bondy, who I mentioned before, he fought in the Vienna Revolution, he fought with John Brown in Bleeding Kansas, he fought in the Union Army. Schama says that Bondy wrote this in his diary on January 1st of 1863 in response to the Emancipation Proclamation. Right? So he's an anti-slavery Jew and he's saying, this means no more pharaohs and no more slaves. But if you go to the Center of Jewish History, as I've done many times, and you look at the diary and the memoir, it says nothing like that. It doesn't say that. It says no more slaves return to their masters. Not very poetic. And if you look up August Bondy online, if you Google him right now, you'll find that quote also repeated again and again and again. And I thought it was a great quote, and I thought I would title my book it. But finding that it was not real, that it was apocryphal, it was good and it was bad. It was good. I get to ding one of the great historians of our time for, messing that up in some way. And yet I could not use it as my title. So we went looking for another title. And Fear No Pharaoh comes from a line that David Einhorn, the radical reform rabbi that we mentioned, said in his 1855 inaugural sermon in Baltimore. He says, "We fear no Pharaoh on this, something like, sacred soil of liberty," right? So this is a land of liberty for American Jews, right? We fear no Pharaoh. We're free here. But in the same sermon, he's criticizing slavery. Right, so he's both accepting the kind of bounty that America offered, and at the same moment, if not in the same breath, he is criticizing the country for denying the same liberty to others. And no, the book is not only about Jewish abolitionists. That's, as I said before, kind of where I started. I should have mentioned, there was a moment in kind of my thinking about all of this where I realized this actually is not just a story about Jewish abolitionists, or it's best not that it be. I should really try to think about all these other people who took positions that I don't admire or I don't necessarily agree with. And as I said about Rafal before, I should try to think about what they thought they were doing in the context of their times, and try to put myself in their shoes and try to understand how could a Jewish person defend slavery? How did they not see that as contradictory and hypocritical? And why do we? Is the other interesting question. If they did not, why do we? Which is itself like a question that you can historicize. You can try to understand how we came to have these views. So it's not just about Jewish abolitionists, but I am interested in them. I do think that they were right. I think that some of the people who I mentioned in the book as having taken different positions before the Civil War themselves realized after the war that the abolitionists and the anti-slavery perspective had been not only right, but more American and more Jewish, and I think it's I like the title. It makes me think of something out of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, Fear No Pharaoh. That book begins with River Run. It's kind of musical to me, and it's Einhorn, and it just seemed to make sense.
You mentioned Bondi's memoir a couple of times. Has that ever been published?
It has not. Well, it was published by his family in 1910, so just 3 years, I think, after his death. And I don't know how many copies, like not many, in maybe Chicago. You can't find it. You can find it online. But no, it has not been published. When I first read it at the Center for Jewish History more than 10 years ago, I was like, this is a movie. It's actually, the writing itself is not so amazing. It's in some ways diaristic. So it's clip. It's not beautiful writing, but it's very evocative. And it's one of the best documents that we have about what it was like to fight in Kansas with John Brown. And it's just fascinating. It's cinematic more than it is really literary, I would say. So, I didn't know quite what I would do with it right away, but, eventually I realized I need to kind of use it as a primary source and put it in conversation with other Jews who were experiencing these events at the same time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rich, for joining me. I'll try to find an online link to Bondi's memoir. I will link to your book, of course, Fear No Pharaoh. And so I'll link to that. And also I will link to your podcast, Think Back, which you mentioned before you started. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.